Last week we started the prelude of our Eastern Front of World War II week-by-week series, with an episode about the end of World War I and the beginning of the Russian Civil War. This week we will focus on the development of the newly created Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. We will track its professionalization as it fights the Civil War and the Reconquest wars of the 1920s. Additionally, we will look at the Red Navy and the Red Air Force as they begin to rebuild from the shattering defeats of the First World War. This series dives deep into complex and often sensitive historical topics that may not always align with YouTube's guidelines, so your support is essential. By becoming a member or patron, you're helping keep this project alive and ensuring we can continue delivering high-quality content to our viewers without worrying about demonetization. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment, and gain access to future Eastern Front videos and 200 other exclusive episodes. After the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, independence movements sprang up around the former Russian Empire. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Ukraine all became the scene of further fighting. During 1918, a former Russian imperial general was given command of the new Finnish White Army. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim led the German-backed White Forces against the Soviet-backed Red Forces in a brutal civil war that lasted just 3 months. With the help of the German Baltic division, he pushed aside the Reds, and their leadership escaped to Russia. Many refugees attempted to follow them. After the war, Mannerheim helped to form the new Finnish state, eventually becoming president. In Estonia, conflict began just before the October Revolution in Russia. Bolsheviks attempted to seize power, but were pushed out by advancing German troops. After the armistice in the west, German troops occupying Estonia began the long journey home. They left behind a civil government led by Konstantin Pats. Lenin had no intention of allowing the Estonians to remain neutral. In November 1918, he ordered an offensive. Within weeks, the Red Army controlled large swaths of Estonia. This initial success was met with stiffer resistance. The fighting between the Red Army and the Estonians was widened with the inclusion of White Russian forces, as well as Germans. The war would not end until 1920. The Treaty of Tartu set borders between the two states and had the Soviets give up all territorial rights in Estonia. In Latvia, Kallis Ulmanis led a provisional government in the wake of the armistice. Within weeks of the declaration of independence, Latvia was invaded by elements of the Red Army. Initial success resulted in a Soviet puppet state being set up. Eventually, the Red Army's success gave way to determined resistance by a combination of Latvians, Germans, and eventually British and French naval support. In January 1920, Polish and Latvian forces united in an offensive to push the Soviets out. This succeeded, and the Latvians began to negotiate a peace treaty that was signed in August of 1920. Lithuania would not be spared Soviet attempts at domination. In November of 1918, Lithuanian communist cadres were dispatched by the Soviets to set up a friendly government. Lithuanian nationalists resisted this attempt, and they soon had the backing of the Germans. Poles, hungry for a reunification of the medieval Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also resisted the communists. These Polish forces engaged in an alliance of convenience with the Lithuanian nationalists, but had different goals in mind. Fighting between the Soviets and the Lithuanians continued until the Soviet puppet government was forced out of Vilnius in April of 1919. Once the nationalists gained some measure of security from the Soviet threat, bickering over the future of the country set in. The Lithuanian government fought off a Polish coup attempt later that year, and would have to face the spectre of a Soviet invasion for many years yet. The Poles, as we have seen, were not just going to lie down and let their newfound independence slip away. They fought ferociously in the Baltics, both to extend their own influence and to keep the Soviets at bay. In 1919, the Polish military, under Józef Piłsudski, decided to attack Minsk preemptively. His forces worked alongside White Russian forces, but only in an uneasy alliance. These forces attacked in the northwestern portion of the front at the same time as the main Polish body. These attacks stalled out within weeks. Peace talks began in late 1919, but little progress was made. By April of 1920, Piłsudski was growing impatient with these peace talks. On the 25th, he launched an attack that drove deep into the heartland of Ukraine, which had been alternating under Soviet and White Russian control to this point. The Soviets counterattacked deep into Poland, reaching Warsaw. After this attack was repulsed by the Poles in the summer of 1920, the League of Nations stepped in and negotiated a ceasefire to end the conflict. Mutual exhaustion had won the day. A final treaty was signed in March of 1921. We're going to talk about the Polish-Soviet War in more detail down the line. The Soviet government had managed to survive this intense period, though they gained few permanent victories between 1917 and 1921. They had managed to secure Ukraine and Belarus, but failed to bring Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania or Poland to heel. The states of the Caucasus were divided between the Turks, who took parts of Georgia, and the Soviets, who consolidated Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia into the Transcaucasian Socialist Federalist Republic. This republic was promptly absorbed into the new United Soviet Socialist Republics. In Central Asia, the Soviets established 3 republics that were also absorbed into the USSR. The Bukharan, Khorezmian and Abkhazian republics were short-lived, but established among the ashes of former Central Asian territories of the imperial government. The Soviet government would continue to fight the White Russians until 1922, when finally an uneasy peace settled over the ashes of the old empire. The breakup of the Tsar's realm was a bloody affair that took over 5 years to burn itself out. Along the way, millions of people, mostly civilians, would die, and millions more were displaced. New governments with varying degrees of affection and hostility for their citizens took root, while others floundered. Eastern Europe was at peace, even if it took years longer than the rest of the continent to resolve its conflicts. These wars did much to fast-track the professionalization of the Red Army in its first years. Leon Trotsky had been put in charge of midwifing the Red Army into this world in March of 1918. His insistence on organizing a permanent force flew in the face of established Marxist ideology, which in theory was against all state institutions, including the army. Trotsky's energy and creativity as the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs proved to be absolutely critical to building the Red Army in its early days. He was not alone in this endeavor. Stalin also had a strong influence on the party's efforts to build the army. Though usually an opposition figure vis-à-vis Trotsky, he had serious authority in his own right. He would use this authority to shape the army to his liking, putting his allies in charge wherever he could. The Red Army was not born in a day. Instead, it was slowly built up throughout the 1920s. In the beginning, it was a mass of undisciplined, politically unreliable but combat-hardened troops with no real regularized command structure. There was little in the way of organization, few professional leaders, and little intellectual diversity at the highest levels. Overcoming these obstacles would take time and serious effort by the state and the cooperation of the army's brightest minds. This happened through a variety of events, with many factors driving the professionalization of the army. In this video, we will go over 4 of the most important factors that allowed for this professionalization. 1. The vacuum of leadership following the start of the Civil War allowed for junior officers and relatively untried young men to rise to the top, reversing the intellectual ossification that had set in at the top of the Imperial Army. Fresh blood in the officer corps allowed new ideas about how war could be fought to percolate to the top of the institution. This meant that men like Tukhachevsky, Rokossovsky, Zhukov, Vasilevsky and Timoshenko could display their skills. All of these men would go on to become marshals of the Soviet Union. Their intellectual contributions and personal leadership were vital to the Red Army's future. That so many of these future marshals had been non-commissioned officers in the Imperial Army was no accident. Trotsky had decided on a policy of actively recruiting them as junior officers. He had decided these men were the representation of the Marxist ideal of humble social origins, while still possessing the needed practical experience in military command and control. The second factor that played a significant role in the professionalization of the Red Army in the 1920s was its fundamental reorganization carried out by Trotsky, Stalin and Mikhail Frunze. One of the most important efforts was creating a general staff-like system, known as the All-Russian Supreme Staff. This staff had departments for training, mobilization, topography, logistics, planning and administration. This would be the highest military body in the government, with Trotsky at its head. This staff would transform into the Red Army Staff in 1921. Trotsky's efforts to formalize a command and control structure came under fire, as contrary to the first principles of Marxist ideology. This opposition was led by Joseph Stalin. He argued that Trotsky's formulation of the centralized military bureaucracy was inefficient and incompetent, and separated the army from the control of the people. This tension came to a head in March of 1919, when the 8th Party Congress met in Moscow. Delegates argued for 3 days about the organization of the army, and the result was essentially a tie. Trotsky would be allowed to keep his system, but it was forced to undergo a series of reforms. One of the most crucial of these was the tightening of political control over the All-Russian Supreme Staff. From this point forward, commissars would jointly review all officer candidates with representatives from the All-Russian Supreme Staff's personnel department. This would ensure political control of the officer corps, as well as some measure of loyalty to the regime. After this, the existence of the General Staff was rarely questioned. Further debates centered on the level of political control of the apparatus of the staff and the role of the army in the state. The third factor of the Red Army's growing professionalization in this period was the rejection of the militia system as the peacetime replacement for the wartime regular army that had been built to fight the Civil War. Mikhail Frunze and Mikhail Tukhachevsky formed the center of the opposition to a militia-based force. Trotsky, contrary to his earlier support for a regular army, argued for the militia. The army had started to demobilize as early as 1921. This period of demobilization formed the backdrop for the intense infighting over the future structure of the army as an institution. The infighting was fundamentally a political struggle. Trotsky needed to fend off the growing influence of Stalin and his clique on the one hand, and the upsurge of military leaders who wanted a regular army on the other. In this, he ultimately failed on both fronts. Stalin gained power, eventually displacing Trotsky, and the army was regularized, albeit in a mixed form, for several years. From 1922 on, the Red Army would get regular budget appropriations and approval for a formal organization system. This would be subject to some changes over the coming years, as the army proved to be a weapon for political infighting. Generally speaking, though, the Red Army was stable from this point until the purges of the 1930s, which we will cover soon. The last major factor is the early cooperation between the Red Army and its German counterpart in the Reichswehr. It extended beyond just observation of army maneuvers or even technical advice, becoming an entrenched policy effort of both governments. This cooperation was carried out in the development of equipment, tactics, and even industry. It would encompass all three branches of both nations' militaries and become an essential element of the story of the Second World War. Army-level cooperation between the two armies started in the early 1920s. The establishment of a joint armoured warfare school at Kama in 1926 was the pinnacle of this cooperation between them. This school was the breeding ground for the Soviet and German theories of mobile warfare that were deployed in the interwar period and put into practice with such devastating effect in the Second World War. Aside from the Red Army, the Russian Civil War also saw the foundation of the Red Air Force and the transformation of the Imperial Navy into the Red Navy. The Civil War was dominated by land engagements, and correspondingly, the other two branches played little part in the war. The Red Air Force had nominally been in existence since shortly after the October Revolution. This existence was meager, with fewer than 350 operable airframes on hand in 1919. There were hundreds more in the reserve, but many of these had no engines or were considered unserviceable for other reasons. By 1924, this was starting to change. A cooperative training school was built with the Germans at Lipetsk for pilots, and the facility grew from a small backwoods airfield into a modern facility with hangars, repair shops, and even a hospital. German cooperation with the Red Air Force was proving to be a significant boon for both sides. Eventually, Junkers would set up a large factory for the production of aero engines and then airframes in the suburbs of Moscow. This venture ultimately hit a rough patch, with Junkers pulling out of the deal by 1926. However, the mere fact of its existence was indicative of how deeply the two air forces and their governments were attempting to cooperate. The reorganization of the Red Air Force began in earnest in 1924, with a focus on division between frontline service and rear administrative functions, including dedicated naval and land-based aviation commands. Land-based aviation would be divided into strategic and core commands. The strategic command would control interceptors, heavy and light bombers, and reconnaissance forces, while the Corps Command would be focused on army cooperation, tactical recon, and artillery observation. The naval side was planned to include interceptor, recon, and mine-laying squadrons. Filling out this new organization took time, but the problems of manpower and machines were attacked vigorously. The Navy received immediate attention after the October Revolution, in part because its sailors had played such a critical role in the seizure of power. This attention did not extend beyond a takeover of the Navy's structures by Bolshevik functionaries as an attempt to ensure political control of its members and prevent an uprising against the regime. It was not until well after the Civil War that profound changes would be attempted to reform the Navy. These efforts would push out the unreliable imperial officers and the old structures for controlling them. Also, it would form the core of the enlisted sailors into a disciplined body. In 1924, the reforms began in earnest. These revolved around personnel decisions and the command structure, as budget limitations prevented anything more serious at this point. Re-establishing political reliability was the first priority. As part of a wider drive for politicization of the military as a whole, doctrinal discussions started, and they carried all of the political ramifications that the army debates would. The Red Navy would see two schools rise up, similar to the debate between the militia and standing army taking place at this time. For the Navy, the traditional school of thought was populated by some old Tsarist officers and many of the older Bolshevists. They wanted a large navy in the tradition of the American theorist Allred Thayer Mahan. This force of big battleships and corresponding focus on the decisive battle would carry the revolution to the rest of the world and simultaneously beat back any challenges to Soviet naval domination. In opposition to these ideas, the young school stood firm. These men followed the French Unicolle school of thought, and were influenced by British historian and naval theorist Julian Corbett. The Soviet young school believed that control of the high seas, as in the Mahan Doctrine, was impossible, and the best the Soviet Navy could hope for was control of the vital sea approaches to its ports. The narrow approaches of the Baltic Sea were fertile ground for the smaller, lighter raiding ships the young school wanted. By 1930, the question was settled. Tukhachevsky, in his role as Chief of Staff of the Red Army, had aggressively supported the young school. His influence carried the day. The price for victory was steep. The new Red Navy would be subordinated to the army in every way. It would not become a first-class power in its own right, and would be subordinate to the army in budgets, strategic considerations, and even operational concerns. The young school had gotten the doctrine they wanted, but their navy would now have to serve the interests of the army. It wasn't until 1925 that efforts were made to start a technical rebuild of the navy. Efforts were made to reach out to the German Navy for assistance on this front. In 1926, German and Soviet officers began technical cooperation that revolved around submarine command, construction, and engine development. Later that year, a German naval mission was dispatched to tour the Soviet Navy and its installations. This was a new level of cooperation for the two navies, and resulted in the transfer of several U-boat plans later that year. The German naval mission of 1926 would be reciprocated in 1934 with a tour of Germany's latest naval innovation, the Panzerschiff A. All of this was to be indicative of growing ties between the Soviet and German militaries, which would prove to be the grounds on which cooperation between the governments would flourish in the next decade. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week, we'll track the development of the Reichswehr and the political turmoil as the Weimar Republic attempts to navigate the 1920s. If you're interested in a deeper dive into the Russian Civil War, we have a patron and member exclusive series on these events. You can join their ranks via the links in the description to watch it. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the Eastern Front of World War II series. You don't want to miss it, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly patron and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.